Hello, everybody. In my first year at KU, I took an intro to astronomy class. And in this class, our professor told us a story of Galileo and his trial by the Inquisition. See, Galileo was supporting the Copernican model of the solar system, where the Earth revolves around the sun, the one that we've all learned. But at the time, the Catholic Church pretty much ruled everything in Europe. They were in charge of the universities, they were in charge of collecting taxes. And when this new idea was voiced, they were threatened by it because they held that, the sun revolves around the Earth is the center of everything. And so what they did was they threatened Galileo with torture unless he recanted his support for the theory. And he did. And I remember when I heard this story, it slightly upset me that he recanted his support, but obviously I understand that would be a hard dilemma to be in. But it made me think about what the meaning of that story was, and how it's not about a conflict between two different sides. It's about a paradigm shift, and it's about truth. And it's about being afraid or accepting to move into truth or wanting to walk away from it. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk about the Koch brothers and Koch campus, but it's not about the Koch brothers at all. It's about the corporatization of higher education, and it's about liberating truth for all of us. So don't think about the Kochs in terms of politics. They are just like a placeholder for a bigger story that I would like you all to hear. So this is Charles and David Koch. You probably know them because of their political activities. They're planning on, they've budgeted $889 million just for the 2016 presidential election, and this is what they're most well known for. And they have a specific goal that they're trying to realize through their political action, and this is a speech that Charles Koch gave in 1974 at the Institute for Humane Studies board meeting in Dallas, Texas. And what he was speaking about here was the anti-capitalist mentality in America and how prevalent it is and how worried he is about it and how businessmen can push back against this mentality. And he also goes on to say it's not just coming from radicals, it's coming from institutions of higher learning, it's coming from scholars. And he goes on to charge scholars with 3 activities. 1, the extensive research and writing in economics, history, and politics. 2, the systematic education of students as socialist scholars. And 3, the use of every available means to maintain a constant barrage of scholarly-sounding propaganda against the free market and business. So he goes on to describe 4 ways that him and his fellow businessmen can fight for the pro-capitalist mentality. And the 3 strategies that he lists that are defensive are through the media, legal challenges, and also through political action, which is, their main focus, well, as far as we know. And then the 4th way is education. And this is their only offensive strategy. And it's also what they use to complement the other 3 defensive strategies that they have. And so since 2005, the Kochs have given over $68 million to universities across the country. But they've actually been giving to universities since the mid-'70s, and over hundreds of millions of dollars have been funneled into schools across the country. And when we're looking at these numbers, we can only see what they report on their tax reform. So any donation that comes from them personally, we can't actually view that. And just last year, Charles Koch and his wife were listed on the KU Endowment $1 million donors club, or whatever it is that they call it. But that's not listed in their 990s, so we don't know exactly what the number is. So these are the 3 defensive strategies that they're complementing, and in the story of what's happening at KU, I'm going to show you how education complements all 3 of these. So in the 90s, this was the first phase of Koch funding that came into the university. And it was about a $1 million donation that went to the School of Business and the School of Law to start the Law and Organizational Economics Center. And the person who came to head up this effort and start the center and be the director of it was Henry Butler. And Henry Butler came from George Mason University, which is where he was running the Law and Economics Center where he would run federal judicial education programs for federal judges and teach them about economics and how their rulings affect the business community when they're talking about health and safety regulations or environmental regulations. And so Henry Butler got $500,000 from the Kochs to come to KU to start this Law and Organizational Economics Center in '93. And the school got $1 million. And so since then, they started running state judicial education programs. And this is a screenshot from one of their pamphlets that they send out to judges saying, you know, this is an opportunity, and it's actually a free, it's all expenses are covered through this program. They take them to resort locations to teach them about economics from a market-based management perspective, and they can spend up to $5,000 per judge on these seminars that are still happening today. And I think the number is over 3,000 judges have attended these over the years. But in '99, it blew up in the press. The Wall Street Journal did an article on this and exposed what was happening at KU. And so the center was dissolved in 2001, which brings us to the next phase of Koch funding at the university. And this is, the Center for Applied Economics was started in 2004, and it's effectively a free market think tank. The Kochs gave $600,000 donation in 2004 to start the center, and Art Hall was hired to be the director of the center. Now, Art Hall came from Koch Company's public sector, where he had been working as the chief economist for 7 years. Koch Company's public sector is the legal and lobbying arm of Koch Industries. And so this is presumably what the network of his political activities would have looked like before the university comes into play. We see Art Hall coming from Koch Company's public sector, working to advise business people and policymakers in Topeka, working with Kansas Policy Institute and ALEC, who also give reports to Topeka. And then this is after he comes to the University of Kansas. He moves from Koch Company's public sector to KU. What the Kochs gain from this is decentralization and legitimacy, because it obscures the connection between the funding and the information that's coming out. And it makes it appear to be legitimate because it's coming from a university. And so this is an example of one of the reports that comes from this center. And this is a car with the license plate says the Kansas budget. And in the back seat, we have highways, higher ed, K through 12 spending, social services, all driving the Kansas budget off of a cliff. And this is underwritten by the Kansas Policy Institute, which also receives funding from the Kochs, and also he writes reports for ALEC, which also receives funding from the Kochs. But what you see here is the gaining of an academic credential, which is why they're gold. But and so when they get this report, it's coming from a university, and on the first page it has a guarantee of quality scholarship, where it doesn't indicate at all that Kansas Policy Institute receives money from the Kochs. It doesn't indicate that the Center for Applied Economics was founded and is still funded by the Kochs. And it doesn't indicate that Art Hall still has a connection with them, because he still receives part of his salary from Koch foundations. It does say that he used to work for them, but there's no indication that what's happening at the university has any connection with the funders who have given the money to that institution. And that's where the problem comes in, because if we don't know the source, but it's coming from a university and appears to be authentic, how can we be certain that it's unbiased? And so the other effect that this second round of funding had at KU is an effect on curriculum. And this comes in to supplement their media organizing efforts. See, the Koch foundations give money to different media outlets across the country, and they also give money to a lot of different universities. And so we like to call this priming the public. Because even though in these contracts, when the Koch foundations give money to a school, there's usually a contract that goes along with it, where there's restrictions that are laid out, with what they expect to be done with the funds that they've given to the university. And while in these restrictions we don't see explicit, major direct control over curriculum, that's not something that we see at all. But we do see control over hiring procedures. And when you're in control over hiring procedures, You don't really need to exercise control over curriculum because you've decided who's going to be teaching. And if that's someone who used to work in your lobbying and legal subsidiary, you can be pretty certain that they're going to be on board with your philosophy. And so sure enough, these are two classes that come from the business school's course catalog. And up here we see a course on market-based management. Now, market-based management I mentioned before when I was talking about the judicial education programs because it's the economic perspective from which Charles Koch advocates the privatization of most public services. The invisible hand, right? Government's role is reduced to just protecting the market. And so up here we have a class on market-based management and another class that's actually taught by Art Hall that has an introduction to market-based management in it. And I've actually analyzed the syllabi of these courses, and BE 710 is almost exactly the same as BE 301, which is a required course for undergraduates in the business school. And it's the last economics course that they're required to take. And after looking at the syllabus, it all comes from the Austrian School of Economics, and it all comes from the market-based management perspective. And so that's slightly worrisome, because if they are able to, and this isn't just the Kochs that do this, this is many, many private donors that are all coming from the same sort of idea, like, we want to give you money so that we have some sort of a return on investment, right? And so that's the idea that's being propagated. And it's not just coming from the Kochs at all. This is just an example. I'd like to read one last quote from the speech that Charles Koch gave at the board meeting. And he talks about how when you go through education, you gain a multiplier effect. And he states that any program adopted should be highly leveraged so that we reach those whose influence on others produces a multiplier effect. And that is why educational programs are superior to political action. And supporting free market scholars is preferable to mass advertising. The reason that education is so important is because power truly does equal knowledge. Power does not emanate from individuals, it emanates from beliefs and what we hold to be true. When we as a society are afraid of acknowledging something outside of ourselves that exists, and we all hold on to moral relativism because we're protecting the self, we are controlled by fear, and we're afraid of the truth. And that is not what we should be. We should not be afraid of the truth. It is the singularity that unites us all, and it's the only thing that we can be held accountable to. And when people can come into institutions of higher learning that are supposed to be beacons of truth, they're supposed to be where we can go and receive truth. Like that's the ideal university. Obviously, that has not necessarily happened, but it could be a reality, and it's our choice. And I'd like to close with a poem by Mary Oliver that actually just goes along quite well with the theme of tonight's event, Footprints. This is called The Journey. One day you finally knew what you had to do, and you began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing that you could do, and determined to save the only life that you could save. Truth does exist. It can be accessed through reason, but it's not only bound to reason. Truth is additive, it is increasing in complexity, and it builds, and it liberates. It is not something that we should be afraid of. It is not something that we can run from. And it's certainly not something that we should color as profit or growth. because that only allows profitable or growth-related truths. And those aren't the only truths that exist. Thank you.